Hey, good morning. My name is Justin. I'm one of the pastors here at Hope City. I'm so glad that you guys are here today. I've been looking forward to this morning for really all week. I've been in California most of the week at a conference for pastors and their wives. Even though my wife wasn't with me, it was for pastors and their wives. And I just got had a really good week of worship and teaching, and I just feel refreshed coming back and being with you guys today. And so if you're a guest with us today, as Brandon said, we're extremely honored that you would be here. Know that the Colts are playing today. You could be tailgating right now, but it is Jacksonville, so who knows, right? And so, but we're grateful that you're here and hope that you feel at home. And if I can answer any questions for you, I'd love to have you find me after the service, and I'd love to introduce myself to you and let you know a little bit more about the church. But one of the things we say around here all the time is Hope City is a place where you can belong before you believe. And so no matter where you are in your spiritual journey with God, we really believe that God is going to meet each of us here as we interact with Him. And so we're in the second week of our Stranger Things series. We kicked it off last week, and we're kind of piggybacking on the momentum that we hope that will happen on the 27th of October, I think, when season 2 of Stranger Things comes out on Netflix. There are some Stranger Things. I like the show, but there are people who love the show, and I like it, but I'm not like a diehard about it. But we're talking about the miracles of Jesus. And one of the things that we said last week is there are some strange things in the Bible. There's talking donkeys, there's water parting, there's sun standing still, and that's just in the Old Testament. And when you get into the miracles of Jesus, things get really, really creepy and really, really strange. And if you don't think that miracles are strange, then maybe you haven't ever read about the miracles, because they're just unexplainable. And I think it's okay when a miracle is unexplainable, because if everything could be explained about God, would He really be God? And so we're taking the next 5 weeks now, including this week, just leaning into the tension of some unexplainable, miraculous things. And what we're saying is, okay, God, we believe that you did those things then, and we're asking you to do those things again in our life. What does it look like to experience the miracles of Jesus in our day? And so last week we just kind of had a simple definition of a miracle, and it's just a divine solution to an earthly problem. Like if you want to boil down what a miracle is, it's a divine interaction. It's a divine solution to an earthly issue. And over and over again, you see this in the scriptures where God intervenes. God comes through. God's presence is made known. God's power is felt. And there is a divine solution. There's a healing. There's a raising of the dead. There's water turning into wine. There's people who are blind, but now they can see. All of these physical and earthly things are solved with God's divine power. And so today what I want to talk to you about is I want to talk about the process of waiting for God to show up in miraculous ways. Maybe you have experienced your timing not being God's timing. Or maybe God's timing not being your timing. And maybe it's caught you off guard, maybe it's disappointed you, maybe it's discouraged you. But I have spent years of my life at times waiting on God to show up in a relationship, waiting on God to show up in an issue or a struggle, not knowing where God's presence was, not being able to hear God's voice. And so how can we respond well? How can we be faithful? How can we allow the waiting portion of the miraculous in our life to grow our faith? When my oldest son, Micah, was in kindergarten, my wife called me and said, hey, there's severe weather. They're dismissing school early because there's numerous tornadoes that have been forecast, and so they're letting the kids out of school. I'm at a doctor's appointment with Elijah. Can you go home and meet Micah off the bus so that he's not scared, when the tornado comes, and maybe get him down in the basement rather than staying outside and watching the storm like you typically do? And so I left my office, I went home, and my oldest son is very terrified of storms, and he gets that because my wife is very terrified of storms, and she taught him to be terrified. You're not born terrified of storms. You're taught it. It's conditioned in you, and my wife conditioned my son that if you are near a tornado, you're going to die. And so that was his mindset, so he was deathly afraid of it. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to stop on the way home. I'm going to get him some ice cream so that when I greet him off the bus, he won't notice the hail, he won't notice the clouds, he won't notice the high winds. He'll just have some DQ. And so I go to Dairy Queen, and the house that we lived in at the time, it sat off the road, and there were trees that lined our driveway, so you could not see the house from the end of the driveway, and I didn't want him to have to walk through the hail and the rain and the wind, and so I thought, I'm just going to sit here, I'm going to wait for the bus to show up. And so I sat there and I waited and I waited and I waited and I waited, and about 35 minutes goes by. And I'm starting to get nervous. I'm like, oh my gosh, kind of made fun of my wife for overreacting on the phone, and then I'm going through worst case, like what if the bus is turned over? What if it's been picked up like Twister and just like thrown into a field, right? I'm like going through all these scenarios, and as I look down, my phone starts ringing, and the caller ID says home. That's when we had a home phone, and it just says home, and I freak out because I know my wife is not home. My 5-year-old son is home, and I pick up my phone. I'm like, hello? And it's Micah bawling his eyes out. He's like, Daddy, I'm at home and it's hailing and it's storming and you're not here. What's going on? And I just said, I'll give you $100. Never repeat this again, okay? Just don't tell your mom, all right? Just whatever you do. I got you ice cream, but there's a $100 bill underneath it, okay? Just let's keep this between us. I was in the right place, just not at the right time, right? And I've experienced those times in my life in my relationship with God where I thought I was in the right place and I thought it was God's timing, but for whatever reason, I missed God's timing. I either showed up late and God had already moved on, or I showed up early and I did my own thing and I asked God to join me. And I made sure that God knew that He was not on my agenda. See, waiting on God seems confusing and inconsistent, and it's hard to predict. There doesn't seem to be a formula or a pattern, even as you look at Scripture. Waiting on God is hard to figure out, and it's a strange thing to try to figure out God's timing. And I went through a season of my life a couple years ago where I just was praying, God, if you'll just lead me, I'll follow. Like if you'll just speak, I'll listen. You ever been in that place where it's not an obedience thing, it's just a distance thing? Like you're willing to obey, you're willing to listen, you're willing to lean into what God wants for you. You just have no idea what He wants for you. And I was so fearful of making the wrong decision, and I was talking with a friend of mine who's about 10 years older than me and just super wise and super helpful, and he just said, Justin, he said, I found it's hard to steer a parked car. Sometimes you just have to move and allow God to direct you along the way. And one of the things I realized this week as I was studying for this message is that waiting on God is not a passive activity. Waiting on God requires patience, but it isn't passive. And here's why it's not passive. Because who we become while we're waiting is way more important than what we're waiting for. Whatever you're waiting on God to show up, whatever you're waiting on God to reveal, whatever in your life you're waiting on God to speak into you, who you become in that process is way more important than what's on the other end of God's plan for you. God's plan for you is just the cherry on the sundae. It's just the icing on the cake. Who you become in that process is God's greatest concern. And as you look through the Old Testament, there's oftentimes years that go by between God promising something and God showing up. Over and over again in the Old Testament, miracles come after a season of waiting. And so I started thinking about all the parables, all the miracles in the Bible, all the miracles in the New Testament, all the miracles that Jesus performs, and that pattern exists in Jesus' miracles too. Look at some of these passages. Luke chapter 5, verse 12, it says, in one of the villages, Jesus met a man with an advanced case of leprosy. When the man saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground, begging to be healed. Lord, he said, if you're willing, you can make me clean. You can heal me, make me clean. So the author wants you to know there's an advanced case of leprosy. Another translation said leprosy covered his body. And leprosy was a disease that advanced and it spread as the longer that you had it. And so the implication here is this guy has had leprosy for a long time. John chapter 9, verse 1, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. So this guy has had his entire life, he has struggled with not just being outcast and not just being a socially set aside, because that's how people who were lame, that's who people who were blind were treated in that. He has had no sight since he was born. And the people in Jesus' day viewed that as he was spiritually ostracized. He must have done something wrong. He must have done something to offend God for God to inflict this punishment on him. And he had lived with that his whole life. Luke chapter 13, verse 10 through 13 says this. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was teaching in a synagogue, he saw a woman who had been crippled by an evil spirit. She had been bent double for 18 years and was unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Dear woman, you are healed from your sickness." 18 years she had walked bent over. 18 years waiting for a miracle. John chapter 5, verse 3 through 5. Inside the city near the sheep gate was the pool of Bethesda, with five covered porches. Crowds of sick people, blind, lamed, and paralyzed, lay on the porches. One of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. 38 years of begging, 38 years of suffering, 38 years of being ill. 38 years of waiting on a miracle. Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 27. So they arrived in the region of Gerasenes, across from the Lake of Galilee. As Jesus was climbing out of the boat, a man who was possessed by demons came out to meet him. For a long time he had been homeless and naked, living in the tombs outside of town. See, over and over again, we're given this picture that sometimes God does not show up on our timetable. Sometimes God allows years to go by before the miraculous happens. Why? I have no idea. But here's one of the truths I hope you take away today, and it's the premise for this entire message, and it's the delay of hope is not the denial of God's healing. The delay of hope in your life is not the denial of God's healing in whatever situation or whatever issue that you keep bringing up to Him. So the passage of Scripture I really want to dive into this morning is actually found in Mark chapter 5. And it's one of my favorite miracles that Jesus performs because it's actually a twofer. It's a 2-for-1 miracle. Like there's two miracles that happen inside this one. It's like buy one, get one free coupon that's used here. But it's kind of a long passage, so you can follow along on the screens or on the app. It says this: when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side. So if you notice, it says again crossed over. He's leaving where the demon-possessed guy who had lived in the tombs was. He had just cast out these demons. He comes back across the lake, and he encounters this. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she'll be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman who was there had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Again, time. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and she had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I could just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around to the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" You see, the people who were crowding around you, the disciples answered, and you ask, "Who touched me?" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some of the people from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, came up and said, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anybody follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw commotion with the people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and they went where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. I love the last line there. I just can't get enough of that. She's been dead. She's probably hungry. Let's have some PB&J, okay? Let's fix her some fish and some chips, all right? Now, what I want to do today is I want to give you 4 realities of waiting, 4 realities that you're going to experience as you wait on the miraculous. And then at the end of each of these principles, I want to ask you to ask yourself an application question. And this application question, if you're willing to write it down, if you're willing to take it with you, I think it's going to tell you the condition of your heart as you wait on God to show up in your life. Okay? So that's kind of the format. So the first reality of waiting on God is this: desperation is attractive to Jesus. Desperation is attractive to Jesus. Verse 23, it says he pleaded earnestly. This is Jairus. Pleaded earnestly with him. "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she'll be healed and live." What we don't see there in that verse, in verse 22, it says he fell at his feet. There's a sense of desperation. And this is not just a person coming to Jesus. This is a synagogue leader. This is the same group of people. He's out of the same group of people who will eventually crucify Jesus. This guy steps out of the ranks of the synagogue leaders and he says, "You know what? My only hope is Jesus." So this is a risky move for him to be so desperate for Jesus. A few years ago, my wife and I were in Pennsylvania doing a marriage conference. And The marriage conference was Friday night and then Saturday morning, and then we stayed over and then we spoke on Sunday morning. And so after we get done speaking on Sunday morning, this lady comes up to my wife back at our book table, and she just starts pouring out her heart. She had not been there on Friday night. She had not been on there Saturday. She had only come on Sunday. And she starts just pouring out her heart about what a mess her marriage is and how messed up her husband is, and he wasn't there, so it was easy for her to say that. And just how, she needed, help in her marriage. And Trish said, you know what? She's like, I love this church. There was one of the guys that was a pastor of the church was in our youth group, and that's how we got connected with them. And so she starts telling that story. She's like, this church has such a heart for relationships. This church has such a heart for marriages. We gave them permission to video this entire conference, and they're going to be able to sell it after they get it duplicated for $20. $20, you could get the DVDs, you could take them home. And she's like, I don't know about that. My husband, he's so far gone, he's not going to watch those. And Trish's like, well, this church has an amazing counseling center. Like they have 4 or 5 different counselors that are actually on staff, and they have in-house marriage counseling. So if you're a part of this church and you're already a part of the ministry of this church, you can go to the counseling. I don't know if it's free, I don't know how much it costs, but they offer it. And she's like, I don't know if I've never been to counseling. I don't know if I can do that. Trish's like, well, we have some resources that you can get it back at here at our table. We have our book. We have this marriage devotion you can buy. It's a whole year long. And she's like, nah, I don't think my husband would ever do that with me. And I just stayed there and watched. I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, what are you talking about? Like, how messed up really is your marriage? It's not messed up to watch a $20 DVD. It's not messed up enough to make a couple of counseling appointments. You're not desperate enough to buy a $10 book. Like, why are we having this conversation? And what I realized as I walked away from that, as I'm kind of judging this woman, is I do the same thing with God. Like, I do the same thing with God. I pray to God and I ask God to show up, but I'm not really desperate. And then I give him excuse after excuse after excuse why that won't work and that won't work, and I can't forgive that person because they won't really reconcile the relationship, and I shouldn't really say I'm sorry there because that wouldn't really help that, and I really, shouldn't really make that change because God, you're not really going to do this. And I justify in my mind why I'm not desperate for God. You know why? Because we equate desperation with weakness, and Jesus equates it with willingness. That's what Jesus sees. When you're desperate for God, Jesus doesn't see you as weak. He sees you as willing. You're ready to receive a miracle when you're desperate for Jesus. See, what impresses Jesus isn't Jairus' title. It's not his leadership skills. It was not his religious activity. What moved Jesus to agree to go to his house wasn't his education or his position. It was Jairus risking everything in that moment. His decision to beg Jesus for help in public was an acknowledgement that my position at the synagogue can't help me and my religious activity can't help me. Jesus, you're all I got. And one of the things I've realized in my life is that when I know that Jesus is all I have, I realize that he's all I need. Otherwise, I'm constantly trying to supplement with my own strength and my own talent and my own ability and my own knowledge everything that Jesus really wants to give me. See, maybe God is waiting for us to want a miracle for us as much as he wants it for us. So here's the application question. How desperate are you for Jesus? How desperate are you for God? Because desperation in your life isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of willingness. Reality number 2, your plan will be interrupted. Your plans are going to get interrupted. Jairus' daughter is sick. She's on her deathbed. Jairus knows it's only a matter of time before she dies. So he comes up with this plan. He's going to go to Jesus. He's going to fight through the crowd. He's going to write this little speech. He's going to approach Jesus. He's going to fall to his face in humility. He's going to beg Jesus to come to his house. And he's calculated how much time it's going to take him to get to Jairus or to get to Jesus and how much time it's going to take Jesus to go with him and get back to his house. And so he goes and he executes this plan flawlessly. And Jesus is impressed. Jesus is intrigued. Jesus says, you know what? I'm willing. And so they stand up and they start walking toward the house of Jairus. Everything is going according to plan until verse 30. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched me?" See, someone interrupts Jairus' plan and steals his miracle. As power goes out of Jesus to heal the woman who's been sick for 12 years, the 12-year-old girl dies. Who does this guy think he is? Who does this woman think she is? She isn't as religious as Jairus. She isn't as important as Jairus. She doesn't have the social standing as Jairus. She doesn't have the religious clout as much as Jairus. She doesn't deserve this miracle as much as Jairus does. He's been serving God his whole life. And I think some of you have been there, haven't you? Your dream dies and someone else's dream takes off. Your marriage falls apart while someone else's marriage is restored. You lose your dream job on the same day that your friend gets their dream job. You break up with your boyfriend and the next weekend your roommate gets engaged. You find out that you can't have kids and everybody around you is a baby factory. See, when our plan gets interrupted, we come face to face with our motivation. And the question is, for me, is do I want Jesus more than I want what Jesus can give me? Do I really want the person of Jesus and the power of Jesus and the spirit of Jesus and the humility of Jesus and the vision of Jesus and the compassion of Jesus, or do I just want what Jesus can give me? That's the application question here. When your plan gets interrupted, do I pursue Jesus for what he gives me or for who he is? See, motivation matters. Motivation comes through when our plan is interrupted. Third principle here, your faith will be tested. If you're waiting on a miracle, your faith is going to be tested. Maybe for some of you, you've trusted God and you stepped out in faith and you took a risk and you were obedient and you were the one that kept your word and you were the one that followed God and when people in your family didn't, or when your spouse chose not to. And God didn't come through. He didn't make it in time. He didn't show up like he thought he should. Hope was lost. I'm going to give a little bit of a facility update later after the service, or kind of at the end of the service. But about 3 weeks ago, we signed a 2-year lease here in June of 2016. Okay, so if you count 2 years, that would be June of 2018, we have to figure something out, right? And so about 3 weeks ago, I get an email stating that we can't meet here on November the 5th. We can't meet here on November 19th. We can't meet here on December 3rd. We can't meet here once per month from January to Easter. And I wish I could tell you that I just responded in faith like God's going to provide. What I really did was like, are you kidding me, God? Like, what are you doing here? Like, come on. And it was just this moment of sheer defining my faith. Like, I was like, okay, are you going to lean into God and lean into the vision that he has for your church, which isn't really your church, it's really his church that you get to actually serve in? Or are you going to panic and try to control this on your own? And I just thought, well, I'm going to try to control it on my own. That's what I'm, I was just being honest with you. And so, we start having these conversations with this other church, and we were already actually in conversation with this other church. And I just kind of came to the end of myself, and I finally just said to my wife, and I said to God, like, I got nothing. Like, God, you're just going to have to show up. And I think that God allows us to come to the end of ourselves so that we actually turn to him. And I wish I did it earlier. I've gotten better over 30 years of following Jesus. Like, it doesn't take me as long now, right? It used to take me a couple months. Now that was maybe a couple days. Sometimes it's a couple hours. But I think some of you have been there where you've been in a situation where your faith is tested. Look at verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some of the people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and they said, your daughter is dead. And then but look at these two words that I think so often make their way into our heart. Why bother the teacher anymore? Why bother anymore? Why bother praying? Why bother trusting? Why bother the teacher anymore? When we've waited on God by pursuing him and things don't play out like we think we should, and people in our life that are well-meaning just sit back and go, what are you doing? Why bother? Why go to counseling? Why pursue health? Why try to, be generous financially? Why bother living out your faith anymore? And what I've come to realize is that God is much more concerned with my character than he is my calendar, and he'll oftentimes delay miracles in my life until I have the character to sustain them. And so here's the application question. Am I willing to be transformed in the waiting? Am I willing to allow God to transform my heart as I wait for him to show up? Last principle. One touch, one word, one command from Jesus changes everything. See, Jairus thought his miracle was stolen. He thought that his daughter was dead. He thought that hope was lost. Hope was only asleep. I don't know if that was her name, but hope was only asleep. Look at verse 42. Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. I don't know. What I love about the Bible is it gives quirky details. Like, why do we need to know that the guy was sick for 38 years? Why do we need to know that the lady was bent over for 18 years? What's the correlation between this woman being sick for 12 years and the girl being 12 years old? Just that from the day that this girl was born, this woman was sick. And Jesus healed both of them. See, what Jairus thought, he was going to trust Jesus for healing. What Jairus got was a resurrection. Jairus got way more than he ever bargained for. Jairus got way more than he ever asked for. And maybe you've given up, and maybe you feel like hope is dead in your life, and you say, you know what, Justin? You don't know my past, and you don't know my husband, and you don't know my dreams, and you don't know my parents. You don't know my failures. You don't know my hurts. You don't know my disappointments. And I would say to you, you're absolutely right, I don't. I know a God who not only heals, he brings resurrections. I know a God who brings dead things back to life. I know a God that makes all things new. 12 years sick and 12 years old. A touch from Jesus, a command from Jesus, a word from Jesus changes everything. And so here's the application question. Am I willing to hold out for hope? Are you willing to hold out for hope in your relational world? Are you willing to hold out for hope as a parent? Are you willing to hold out for hope in your finances? Are you willing to hold out for hope in your career? It doesn't mean that God's going to show up in the way that you think he will, but it does mean that his delay is not his denial. There's always hope, and maybe not on this side of heaven, maybe on the other side of heaven, but there's always hope. My mom texted me yesterday as I was on my flight, and her sister, my aunt, passed away yesterday afternoon from cancer. And she'd been sick for a while. And whenever something like that happens, it brings definition to what's important, right? It like just causes you to step back, and it causes you to not really care about the menial things of life. And my mom is sad. My mom, her sister passed away. But she said, I have a hope that is beyond this life. And I don't know where your hope lies. Maybe it lies in your abilities. Maybe it lies in your giftedness. Maybe it lies in your affluence. Maybe it lies in your ability to figure things out and solve problems and be your own God. But at some point, you're going to need a hope that's greater than yourself. You're going to need God to show up in ways that you can't manufacture. And his delay is not his denial. So don't lose hope in the waiting. It's often in the waiting that we look back, and the miracle that we longed for, that we actually received, wasn't really the greatest miracle of all. It was who we became while we waited. And that was God's plan all along. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you so much just for showing up today and being here with us. Thank you for your word that we get to dive into and learn from. And God, we admit that we try to control and manipulate. We don't see desperation as strength or willingness. We see it as weakness. And so, God, would you change our perspective? Would you allow us to do an introspection in our heart this week and just ask ourselves these questions? And look for the ways that you're showing up in who we're becoming, not just what we want from you. So in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, hey, I want to introduce you to a couple of folks here. This is Joe and this is Lindsay. And Sarah Ackerman is on our creative team. And we were planning out this service a few weeks ago and just talking about this idea of waiting. And Sarah said, you know what, I know a real life story that would bring some power to your message because it's not going to be that powerful. No, she didn't say that. She said that sometimes it's easy to just receive what God says in his word and not really be able to put flesh on how it can play out in our life. And so Sarah's going to walk Joe and Lindsay through their story. And so can we give them a huge Hope City welcome?
Hey guys, this is Lindsay and Joe. I met Lindsay and Joe when I was in the middle of my own fertility struggles. And when I met them, they were years into theirs. In that time, they just became such a great source for me because they chose exactly what Justin talked about today. They chose to refuse to be passive while they were pleading to God for their miracle. So I'm super thrilled to bring their story to Hope City today. So you guys, I know the waiting period for your child was a really long one. Tell us your story of how that all went.
Yeah. So Joe and I got married in 2000, and we moved to Chicago and had fun careers and enjoyed being in the city and kind of did things at our own pace, traveled internationally, and just had a blast. And then we said, I think it's time to have kids. So we decided to move to Hamilton County, kind of midway between both of our families. And so in 2006, we moved here and said, well, we're gonna have a family, so let's start trying to get pregnant. And it didn't go like I thought it would. It doesn't go anything like the movies or books. So for a couple years, we really struggled through infertility. And I kind of knew the cards were stacked against me. I have a disease called endometriosis. And in some people, it affects them with infertility. My mom had it, my sisters had it, my grandmas had it, but they all had kids. So I thought, well, I'm going to have kids. They did. But that wasn't my story. So I spent many an hour right over here, actually, I just realized this, at Midwest Fertility, trying to get pregnant for years and had 2 miscarriages. And then in the fall of 2009, I was with my aunt in Connecticut, and she had 8 in vitro attempts before she had her daughter. And I was really struggling with the pain because everybody else was getting pregnant. I mean, sisters, cousins, coworkers. I was just getting sick. If someone else told me they were pregnant, I was going to get mad. I did get mad. And I said, I just don't know what to do, Aunt Jane. And she said, let me ask you, do you think that there is a child that has to be half Joe and half Lindsay for you to feel complete? Or are you just want a child? And I said, I just want a child. And then she said, well, then don't do in vitro, because that's a long trip. So maybe adoption should be an option. And I'm so glad she said that. And so we decided, well, let's go with adoption. So kind of more on our timetable, like he was talking about, we said, well, we're going to do adoption, and we're going to raise this money, and we're going to go with this agency. And come along, God, why don't you come on this adoption journey too? And so it happened pretty quickly. We were chosen right away. We met a birth mom, drove over to visit her, met her family, got all excited. And then June 2010, we arrived at the hospital a few hours after she was born, and we got to hold her and name her. We spent the night in the hospital. We were getting ready to go see her the next morning, and we found out that the birth mom had changed her mind. And so the bottom dropped out. We had a nursery at home. We had a car seat in the car. We had baby showers. We named her. And everything started to fall apart. And little did we know, that was just the beginning of it falling apart, because after that, over the next 2 years, we had 2 more adoptions fall apart. So by the spring of 2012, I had 2 miscarriages and 3 failed adoptions, and I was pissed at God, at my life, at my body, at everything. So.
That's a long, really trying road, and that had to be so hard on you guys. How did that affect you all personally?
Yeah, church is a hard place when you're infertile and you're trying to get pregnant, because we went to a large church in Indianapolis, which they had a baby dedication every 5 minutes, I think. So we were really happy about that. And so we kind of learned early on, and I wasn't very sensitive to Lindsay during the process. I was trying to be the ultimate cheerleader of, it's going to be awesome, and the next one's going to work. And she was feeling like her body was broken, and I wasn't really understanding of what that meant and sensitive to that. So, I wasn't the best support at home, but we tried to, really just have some conversations with God and didn't really have good skills in that. We didn't have a lot of training. I mean, we were actually raised in the church, but we didn't have training of what it's like to have a real conversation with God. So we did learn early on this word, hupomene, which is a Greek word, I think, for enduring trials and like resting under trials. So we tried our best to do what that was supposed to look like. And that was easy in the first year after the adoption fell through. I wouldn't say easy, but not as hard. And then each year it got a little harder to endure. Like, what are we enduring through this process? Why are we waiting this thing out? So for me, it got to a really dark place, and I kind of got to the point when I was just asking questions of maybe we shouldn't even be in this marriage, maybe we're not supposed to be together, maybe that's the problem with this whole thing is we're not the good match. So got to a place where we were meeting with a counselor, and I just told the counselor that I just felt like maybe we were, divorce was the first time on the horizon. So we were just considering that at a certain point. So it got pretty dark. I mean, this was 3 or 4 years after the adoption. So, it never got like much brighter after that for a while.
So when you guys are just rock bottom in the depths of despair, what was it that made you turn towards God instead of away from him?
It was him. It was the Holy Spirit. I don't want to say it was anything that we did. It wasn't a special therapy session that we had or a special service we heard. I think it was just the very gentleness of the Holy Spirit calling us back to him. And it was him that revealed to us so many things in our lives that needed to change. So it wasn't about losing the children. It was really about finding him and finding this peace that even in the midst of all this pain, there could be joy. I remember a very good friend telling me, Lindsay, I know you so long to be a mom, but don't you know that you're a mom to so many people? And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, you're a mom to me. Here's what you teach me. You're a mom to so-and-so. Here's what you teach so-and-so. So God just kept bringing different people in our lives who would speak the truth to us. And the more that we heard that, the more that we started to believe it. So then we could start envisioning maybe we aren't supposed to be parents. Okay, well, what does that look like? So I can't take any credit for it. I mean, it was completely the Holy Spirit, and the way that he was able to mend this, that was just him.
Yeah, we didn't stop going to church. I remember sitting in Sunday after Sunday, not wanting to be there at all. I wasn't kicking and screaming against it, but I just was kind of there out of I guess this is what you're supposed to do, is be here, and maybe something will kickstart from this. We were involved in counseling, separate sessions. We weren't together, but that was super helpful to have real conversation with somebody. And, we also had a small group that we were involved in, and they gave us a good amount of space to throw a lot of stuff at God and have some real honest conversation with him and not be so paranoid that we were on the edge of walking away from the faith. They were okay with ask those tough questions. It's good to have that. I think giving us space to do that was helpful.
Yeah, totally. So, okay, you're years in. You've had some heartbreak. Where does the road for parenthood end up taking you guys?
Yeah, so after that kind of really rough year in 2012, 2013, around the spring, our counselor recommended, hey, maybe you should probably try a different agency, and maybe try to get your money back, because it hasn't been that good. And so that winter, I remember we went and we asked for our money back, and they understood, and we found a private attorney up in Muncie who has a nonprofit, and so she makes adoption really affordable. And she's a believer. She was great, and she worked with us right away, and the process went really quickly. If you've adopted, there's all this paperwork and fingerprinting and all that. And you put together a profile book for a prospective birth parent to choose you. So you have to advertise yourself. So I was working on that, and I got an email from her, and she said, hey, do you have that done? I just had 2 birth moms walk in. They'd like to see your book. And so I actually just sent her the PDF. I didn't actually send her the book. And then 2 weeks later, as we were packing up for vacation, we got a call from the attorney, and she said, hey, you remember that birth mom? Well, she chose you. Do you want to know the gender? It's coming in 4 weeks. And I remember taking clothes out of the dryer, and Joe's like, she wants to know, is it a boy or a girl? What do you? And I was like, sure. And she said, it's a boy. And my heart just jumped. All the other ones had been girls. And so I said, that's our Quinn. Because we had chosen the name Quinn when we were in Ireland in 2006 when we first started the adoption journey. We bought a magnet we put on the fridge, and if we ever had a boy, we would name him Quinn. Backtracking the calendar, we found out that the week we went to our agency and asked for our money back was the week that Quinn was conceived. And he came, and we were there a few hours after he was born, and we went into the hospital. The birth mom was so sensitive to our story, and she had said, if Joe and Lindsay don't want to come, I understand, like this could be traumatic for them, whatever they need. And she gave us space. She gave us her room on the maternity floor. She took another room. We've never met her. We don't know what she looks like. She is the bravest, most wonderful person I've never met, but that I owe so much of my joy to. So we went into the hospital saying, this might be our child or it might not. And God gave us incredible peace, like no nerves, no fear, no nothing. And we knew we were to take care of this child. And she signed the paper in 24 hours, which is pretty quick. And so our son is Quinn Samuel, and he just turned 4. And he's just,
The cutest.
he's just
You
wonderful.
guys, he's so cute and so special and the friendliest kid in the world to the best parents. But what I love so much more than anything, more than even Quinn about your story, is the way that you guys view that waiting period that you have, that you told me that you really believe that God was more concerned with who you guys were becoming than the mission. And tell us just how you guys really feel like God just used that time to make you guys who you are. And I love what you said, that you guys find your joy in Christ and not just in Quinn.
Right.
Yeah, we just got so much more empathetic towards people who were going through some hard times. I know I struggle with that a lot, of just, again, trying to rally people up through those experiences and being sensitive to where they were. Going back a few photos, we were out west with our family, that was my brother-in-law and sister. He's on the far left, she's in the middle. They're now separated. Marriage is over, but being sensitive to that whole marriage, to the process, and those are things that we wouldn't have done years ago. So being sensitive to that. Quinn's an amazing, ambassador for adoption, because he's just the most friendliest kid out there and just wants to tell everybody his story of adoption and what he knows about his birth mom, which is minuscule. But it's cool just to be a part of that experience and to be able to know that that's a story that we shouldn't keep to ourselves. We don't have to blast it everywhere, but at the same time, when opportunities arise, like, what are the ways we can tell that? And yeah, we learned somewhere along the road that this was more than just us becoming parents. Like, God wanted to really work on our relationship with him, and he was good with the hard conversations and the stuff that we threw at him. And it's transformed the ways we are now. I mean, life isn't like blissful. It's not like we don't struggle with things. We still are going through challenges. But we have other ways to approach God now that we didn't have before. So, I mean, that's all from that whole experience.
You guys, can we please give Lindsay and Joe a hand for being here today? Thank you guys for being so strong for me in my struggles, and thank you guys so much for sharing with everybody here. I know we're all going through different struggles, waiting and pleading for our own miracles, and we just appreciate you guys being a good, huge blessing to us today. So thank you guys so much.
Thanks.